She didn't knock. She pounded. Both fists against that door like the storm behind her was already inside her chest, and when Elias Carter finally yanked it open, the young woman on his porch didn't say a word. She just grabbed the doorframe and held on like letting go meant disappearing entirely. "One night," she breathed. "That's all I'm asking. One night." And Elias, a man who had not let anyone pass that threshold in 5 years, looked at her shaking hands, her hollow eyes, and heard himself say something he didn't plan to say. Get inside. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Montana Territory, November 1884. Elias Carter had a rule about strangers. He didn't take them in. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't pride. It was experience, the hard-earned, bone-deep kind that teaches a man what happens when he opens his door to people he doesn't know. People who smile too wide. People who ask too many questions. People who look at what you've built and start calculating what they can take from it. He had learned that lesson early. He had paid for it twice. So when the pounding came, not a knock, not a polite rap of knuckles, but a full, desperate, both-fisted pound against his front door at 7:30, on a night when the temperature had already dropped below freezing, Elias set down his coffee, picked up his rifle, and walked to the door without hurrying. Whatever was out there could wait 30 seconds. Most trouble could. He opened the door, and trouble was not what he found. She was young, mid-20s maybe, dark hair plastered flat against her face, a cloth bag hanging from one shoulder that looked like it had been dragged through every mud puddle between here and the county line. Her coat was the kind made for autumn, not for the wall of cold that had come rolling down from the Canadian border 3 days ago and hadn't stopped since. She was shaking. Not the polite kind of shaking people do when they want you to feel sorry for them. The real kind. The involuntary kind. The kind where your body stops asking your permission and just starts fighting to survive on its own. Her eyes found the rifle first, then found his face. She didn't back away. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be given the state of the rest of her. "I don't want money. I don't want food. I don't want anything that costs you anything. I just need—" She stopped. Swallowed. Started over. "I just need somewhere that isn't outside. For tonight. Just tonight. And then I'll be gone before you wake up and you'll never see me again." Elias looked past her at the road. Looked left, looked right. Nobody else out there. No wagon. No horse. No companion waiting in the dark. "You walk here?" he asked. "Yes." "From where?" A pause. Just long enough to notice. "From the road." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. Hers were a dark, serious brown. The kind of eyes that had been watching people carefully for a long time. "From Caldwell," she said finally. "I left Caldwell 3 days ago." Elias kept his face neutral. Caldwell was 40 miles east. In good weather on horseback, that was a day and a half. On foot, in a coat built for October, in the worst cold snap the valley had seen in a decade. "You walked 40 miles, he said. "I did." "In 3 days?" "Yes." "In that coat." She glanced down at herself. For just a second, something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of someone who has already judged herself harshly for every mistake she made and doesn't need anyone else to do it for them. "I know how it looks," she said. "It looks like you should be dead," Elias said flatly. "I know that too." He studied her for another 3 seconds. Long enough that most people would have started filling the silence with explanations, with justifications, with the nervous chatter people use when they want to talk someone into something. She didn't. She just stood there, shaking, waiting, looking at him like she was prepared for whatever answer he gave and had already made peace with the worst one. That was what decided it for him, not the shaking, not the cold, not the look of someone who needed help. The stillness of someone who wasn't going to beg for it. Elias stepped aside. "One night," he said. You sleep in the spare room, you're gone by sunup. You don't touch anything that isn't offered to you. You don't go through this house. You don't ask me questions." She walked in past him. "Understood," she said. "I didn't get a name." She stopped in the middle of the entryway. Her back was to him. He watched her shoulders settle, a decision being made somewhere inside that he wasn't privy to. "Clara," she said. "Clara Bennett." "Elias Carter." She turned enough to acknowledge it. Then she looked at the door he was still holding open, at the storm howling outside, at the warmth of the room she was standing in. And for just a moment, just one something crossed her face that wasn't exhaustion, and wasn't relief, and wasn't fear. It was grief. Deep, old, practiced grief. The kind that lives so close to the surface that it shows itself in unguarded moments before you can pull it back. Then it was gone. And Clara Bennett walked further into the house like she owned her 12 square inches of floor and intended to protect them quietly and without complaint. Elias closed the door behind her. He had no idea what he had let in. The spare room was at the end of the hall. It had a bed, a washstand, a window that rattled when the wind hit it right, and a hook on the back of the door where his wife Margaret's old winter shawl still hung. He had meant to take it down 100 times. He never had. He showed Clara the room without ceremony, pointed out the washstand, told her there was firewood stacked outside the kitchen door if she needed more heat, told her breakfast was his business and his alone, and she didn't need to worry about it. She listened to all of it without interrupting. "Thank you," she said. Just that. No embellishment. Elias nodded and turned to leave. "Mr. Carter." He stopped. "I meant what I said. I'll be gone before sunrise. You won't even know I was here." He looked back at her over his shoulder. She was standing in the middle of the spare room holding her cloth bag in both hands, and she looked so small and so certain of herself at the same time that it created a strange kind of contradiction he couldn't quite name. "Get some sleep," he said. "You look like you haven't in a while." She almost said something. He could see it the way her mouth opened just slightly and then closed again like she'd thought better of it. Whatever it was, she kept it. Elias went back to his coffee. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not drinking it. Just sitting, listening to the wind, listening to the silence in the rest of the house that was somehow different from the silence of 10 minutes ago, even though he couldn't explain why. There was someone else breathing in this house tonight. He had forgotten what that felt like. He had told himself he hadn't missed it. He picked up his coffee cup, put it down, got up, and went to bed. She was gone in the morning. Or so he thought. Elias came out of his bedroom at 5:30 the way he always did before the ranch hands were up, before the horses needed feeding, before the day had fully decided what it was going to be. He came out in his boots and his shirt and his suspenders, expecting an empty house and silence, and the cold kitchen he'd been starting every morning in for 5 years. What he found instead was smoke. Not the bad kind, the coffee kind. He walked to the kitchen doorway and stopped. Clara Bennett was standing at his stove. Still in her traveling clothes, she clearly hadn't had anything else in that bag, with her hair tied back and a dish towel tucked into her belt and his cast iron skillet in her hand, and she was cooking something. She heard him stop. "I know what you said," she told him without turning around. "I was going to be gone. I know. But I looked outside before I left and saw your men starting the morning chores, and I thought—" She paused, turned just enough to show him the side of her face. "You let me sleep somewhere warm and safe. I thought the least I could do was—" "I told you breakfast was my business," he said. "You told me not to ask questions. You told me not to touch things that weren't offered." She turned back to the stove. "You didn't say anything about cooking." Elias stood in the doorway. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and something frying in that skillet, and underneath it all, something else. Something he hadn't smelled in this room in years. Something warm and indefinable that had nothing to do with food. "Sit down," Clara said. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. "I don't know you," he said. "No," she agreed. "You don't. I don't let people I don't know cook in my kitchen." "I know. But you already let me sleep in your house, Mr. Carter. The cooking is actually less of a risk." She glanced back at him. Her expression was direct and calm and very slightly amused. "Unless you think I've poisoned the eggs." Elias said nothing. He sat down. The eggs were good. The biscuits were not. They came out of the oven looking correct golden on top, right size, good shape. But when Clara set the basket on the table and Elias broke one open and took a bite, it had the texture of something that had been used to build a wall. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You said you could cook," he said. Clara sat down across from him. She looked at the biscuit in his hand. She picked one up herself and knocked it against the table. It made a sound like a stone hitting wood. She stared at it for a long moment. And then she laughed. Not a polite, careful laugh. Not the kind women use when they're trying to be agreeable. A real one, sudden and surprised and genuine, starting somewhere in her chest and making it all the way up before she could decide whether to let it go or not. She let it go. Elias had been reaching for his coffee. He stopped. He had not heard a woman laugh in this kitchen since Margaret died. He had not heard real laughter in this house. Not the quick, controlled kind the ranch hands used, not the awkward kind people use at funerals when they're trying to fill silence, since before that. Since before Margaret got sick. Since before that whole long, terrible winter when laughter became something that lived in other people's houses and not in his. He had been sitting across from it for 4.5 seconds, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "I can cook," Clara said, still catching her breath. "I promise I can cook. I don't know what happened to those. I think I left them in too long because I was watching the coffee." "They're fine," Elias said. "They're rocks. They're good enough." She looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them. Nothing romantic, nothing soft. Just the simple, quiet recognition of two people who have both been alone for too long and are not quite sure what to do with a moment that doesn't feel like loneliness. "I'll make a second batch," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to." He nodded. She got up, and Elias Carter, who had eaten breakfast alone every single morning for 5 years, sat at his kitchen table and listened to someone else move around in his kitchen and didn't tell her to stop. She made a second batch. They were considerably better. The ranch hands came in for breakfast at 7. Tom Reeves, who had worked for Elias going on 8 years and knew better than to comment on anything unusual. Billy Marsh, 19 years old and constitutionally incapable of keeping his mouth shut. And Daniel Crow, a half-Blackfoot man, who had been with the outfit for 3 years and operated on the general principle that most things were not his business. They came through the kitchen door and stopped. Billy opened his mouth. Tom put a hand on his arm before a word came out. Clara looked up from the stove. "Sit down," she said. "Breakfast is almost ready." The three of them looked at Elias. Elias was already eating. They sat down. Clara fed them. She talked to Billy when he couldn't hold himself back any longer. Asked him how long he'd been working cattle. Listened to the answer with real attention. Asked a follow-up question that made him feel like what he'd said mattered. She asked Daniel about the horses, which was the right thing to ask, because it was the only subject that could get more than 3 sentences out of him at a time. She refilled Tom's coffee without being asked, which told Elias she'd been watching the table while she cooked. She was paying attention to all of them. All of them. When was the last time anyone had paid attention to what was happening at this table? Billy was talking about the fence line along the north pasture when Clara said quietly, "Mr. Carter, the coffee." Elias looked down. His cup was empty. She was already beside him with the pot. "Thank you," he said before he thought about whether to say it. She poured, moved on. Tom caught Elias's eye across the table. Elias looked away first. She did not leave that morning, and she did not leave the morning after. She didn't ask to stay. She didn't negotiate. She didn't make any kind of arrangement or put any kind of terms on it. She simply stayed. Did things, made herself useful in ways that were hard to argue with, because they were things that needed doing, and nobody had been doing them. The second day, she cleaned the kitchen, really cleaned it. Not the surface kind Elias had been doing, but the deep, pull everything out and scrub the walls kind that made the room look 10 years younger. The third day, she found the pile of mending. The ranch hands had been accumulating in the corner of the bunkhouse. Ripped shirts, popped buttons, a pair of Billy's pants that had been torn on barbed wire and were held together with hope, and she repaired all of it without being asked. The fourth day, she found the dead herb garden in the planter box on the kitchen windowsill and asked if she could replant it. Elias said yes before he'd thought about it. That bothered him, because the pattern was clear and he was not a man who missed patterns. Every morning he woke up planning to tell her that today was the day she needed to move on, that he appreciated what she'd done, but she couldn't stay indefinitely, that this wasn't a boarding house and he wasn't responsible for her situation. And every morning he walked into the kitchen and found a reason not to say it yet. He started watching her more carefully, trying to find the thing underneath, the angle. Because there was always an angle. He'd been around enough people to know that nobody did something for nothing. Nobody stayed somewhere for no reason. And a young woman alone in the world didn't survive by accident. She was surviving, very effectively. But he hadn't figured out how yet. It was Tom who said what Elias was thinking on the fifth evening when Clara had gone back to the main house after supper and the four of them were in the barn. "She's not looking for a husband," Tom said. Elias kept brushing his horse. "Nobody said she was." "Billy said she was." "Billy says a lot of things." "He's not wrong about everything." Elias looked at Tom over the horse's back. Tom was 52, gray-bearded, and had been observing human beings with quiet accuracy for most of those 52 years. He was not usually wrong about things either. "She's running from something," Elias said. "Most people who show up on a stranger's doorstep in a blizzard are running from something," Tom agreed. "Question is what?" "Question is whether it's going to follow her here." Tom nodded slowly. "You going to ask her?" "Not yet." "When?" Elias went back to brushing. "When I decide I need to know." He decided he needed to know on the 8th day. Not because of anything Clara did, because of what arrived. A man on a gray horse. Well-dressed, well-fed, with the kind of settled confidence that comes from having spent a lifetime being the most important person in any room he walked into. He rode up to the front of the ranch house in the middle of the afternoon, looked the property over like he was appraising it, and asked the first person he saw, which happened to be Billy, where he could find the woman named Clara Bennett. Billy came to find Elias immediately. That was the right call. Elias went to the front of the house. The man on the gray horse introduced himself as Richard Hale, businessman, formerly of St. Louis, currently representing the interests of the Bennett family of Caldwell. "I'm looking for Miss Clara Bennett," he said. His voice was smooth and even, and very accustomed to getting answers. "I have reason to believe she may have come this way." "Lots of people come this way," Elias said. "It's a road. This one would be traveling alone. Young woman, dark hair. She left Caldwell approximately 10 days ago under circumstances that have caused her family considerable concern." He paused. "Her family is very eager to see her safely returned." Elias looked at this man, looked at the horse, looked at the quality of his coat, his boots, the leather of his saddle. Looked at the word he'd used, returned, and the particular way he'd said it, like Clara was a package that had been misplaced rather than a person who had made a decision. "Can't help you," Elias said. "I don't keep track of who comes through this valley." The man looked at him for a long moment. The smooth, even voice stayed smooth and even. "If you do encounter her, I would appreciate knowing about it. The family is prepared to be very grateful to anyone who helps bring her home safely." "I'll keep that in mind," Elias said. Richard Hale touched the brim of his hat, turned his gray horse around, and rode back down the road. Elias watched him go. Then he went inside. Clara was in the kitchen. She had her back to the door and was doing something with the herb seedlings she'd started on the windowsill, and she didn't turn around when he came in, which meant she hadn't heard the conversation outside. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. "Clara," he said. She turned. He looked at her face, looking for something, looking for the thing he'd been circling around for 8 days. "There was a man here," he said. "Richard Hale. Says he's looking for you." The change in her face was immediate and complete. Not panic. Clara Bennett didn't do panic, he was already sure of that. But something underneath the surface of her shifted, and her hands went still on the seedling tray, and her eyes went very careful and very focused. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That I couldn't help him." A breath. One breath measured and controlled. "Thank you. I'm not asking for thanks. I'm asking for what he is to you." She set the seedling tray down. She turned fully to face him, and she looked at him with those dark, serious eyes. And Elias had the clear impression that she was making a decision right now about how much of the truth she was going to tell him, and whether he deserved it. He waited. "He works for my uncle," she said finally. "My uncle, Edmund Bennett. He manages the estate my father left when he died. Manages it very well for himself. He's been managing it since I was 14 years old, and everything I should have inherited when I turned 25 has been very quietly managed into his own accounts over the past 11 years. Elias didn't move. "That's a theft accusation. It's a fact. I have documents. I spent 2 years collecting them." Her voice was level, completely level. "When I confronted my uncle, he gave me a choice. Marry a man he'd selected who would sign over any legal claim I had to the estate, or be declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs and committed to an institution outside the state where I couldn't contest anything." She paused. "I chose the third option. Running. Leaving," she said, firmly. "There's a difference. Running is what you do when you have no plan. I have a plan." He looked at her. "What's the plan?" "There is a territorial court circuit that passes through Billings twice a year. The next session is in March. I have documentation of what my uncle has done, account ledgers, correspondence, copies of property transfers. Enough to file a formal complaint before a circuit judge." She held his gaze. "I needed somewhere to be between now and March that wasn't within reach of my uncle's money. I walked 40 miles in 3 days in the wrong coat because I needed to disappear, and I needed to do it fast enough that he couldn't stop me before I crossed the county line." Elias was quiet for a long time. "You're not a wandering woman looking for shelter," he said. "No." "You're a woman on her way to a lawsuit." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me any of this." Something shifted in her face. Not quite guilt. More like the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a choice made and owned. "You asked for one thing when you let me in," she said. "You didn't ask me questions. You asked me when I'd last laughed." She let that sit for a moment. "I didn't tell you my business because my business wasn't what you needed from me, and you weren't ready to hear it yet." A pause. "Are you ready to hear it now?" He looked at her for a long time. "Richard Hale," he said. "Will he be back?" "Yes." With more than a polite question. Her jaw set. "Very likely." Elias nodded once, pushed off the doorframe. "March is 4 months away." "I know. That's a long time to be somewhere you're not sure you're welcome." Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me to go?" And there it was, the question she'd been carrying since she walked through his door. Not asked with desperation, not asked with manipulation. Asked plainly. The way someone asks a question they genuinely don't know the answer to, and have enough respect for the other person not to try to influence it. Elias picked up his hat from the table. He turned it over in his hands once. "I'm going to go fix the north fence," he said. "I expect supper around 6. He walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she turned back to her seedlings. And somewhere behind the careful set of her face, something that had been braced for impact for a very long time, slowly, quietly began to ease. That night after supper, after the ranch hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet, Elias sat at the table with his coffee and a week's worth of account ledgers. Clara sat across from him with a book. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. The fire in the stove made its small, steady sounds. The wind worked at the windows. The lamplight held them both in a circle of warm gold. And Elias Carter, sitting in the house he'd built with his own hands, that had felt like a shell for 5 years, looked up once from his ledgers and looked across at the woman reading her book and thought, not romantically, not hopefully, just honestly and simply, this is what a house is supposed to feel like. He looked back down at his numbers. Outside, somewhere in the dark, Richard Hale was riding back toward Caldwell. He would be back. And when he came back, he would not come alone. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in longer than Elias Carter could clearly remember, the silence in his house was not empty. It was simply quiet. And there was a difference he had forgotten existed. He turned the page of his ledger. Clara turned a page of her book. And the storm outside moved on to somewhere else. Richard Hale did not come back the next day, or the day after that, which was Elias knew exactly the kind of move a man like that made. Let the waiting do the work. Let the other person sit with the uncertainty long enough that they started making mistakes, started talking too much, started explaining themselves to people who hadn't asked, started doing things that revealed more than they intended to. Elias knew the tactic because he'd seen it used on cattle. You don't chase a spooked animal. You wait until it stops running, and then you move. He didn't tell Clara any of this. He didn't need to. She had figured it out herself. By the third morning, he could tell by the way she'd stopped watching the road every time a sound came from the direction of the gate, and started watching it only once deliberately at the beginning of each day, and then putting it out of her mind and getting on with things. That was discipline. The real kind, not the performed kind. He filed it away. What Elias did tell her on the 9th morning was that Richard Hale would eventually come back with something more than questions, and that when he did, the two of them needed to have a clear understanding of what the story was. The story. Clara looked at him across the breakfast table. What you are to this ranch. What reason you have to be here. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. A woman alone on a stranger's property with no stated reason for being there is a woman who can be removed. A woman who has a purpose here is harder to move. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking it through the way she thought everything through methodically without rushing, arriving at the answer before she spoke it. What purpose would you suggest, she asked. Housekeeper. Cook. He paused. It's the truth near enough. Near enough, she agreed. Then, you'd have to pay me something, even a token amount, otherwise it doesn't hold up. I know. People will talk. People already talk. They've been talking since the morning after you arrived. He said it without apology, because it was simply a fact, and she deserved to know it. Tom's wife sent a message with the feed delivery asking who the woman was at the Carter Ranch. Billy's mother is apparently composing a letter. The preacher's wife has opinions. Clara absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone absorbing information they find neither surprising nor particularly disturbing. And what have you told them? She asked. Nothing. It's not their business. She looked at him. It will become their business. People make it their business. Let them. Elias. It was the first time she'd used his first name without the Mr. in front of it. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she decided not to address it. I don't want to make your life harder than it needs to be. I can keep a low profile. You've been feeding 6 men 3 meals a day and mending their clothes and replanting my kitchen garden, Elias said. That is not what a low profile looks like. She opened her mouth, closed it. Something flashed in her eyes, the beginning of an argument she thought better of. And then she sat back in her chair and looked at him with the kind of expression that meant she was recalibrating. All right, she said. All right what? All right to all of it. The arrangement. The story. A pause. The talking. Elias nodded. I'll pay you $1 a week. That's too much. It's half what I'd pay anyone else. Then it's fine. She picked up her fork. Thank you. Stop thanking me. You keep doing things worth thanking you for. He picked up his own fork, then stopped noticing. And for the second time since she'd arrived, Clara Bennett laughed at his kitchen table. It was a little shorter than the first one, a little more controlled. But it was real, and it hit the air in that room the same way it had the first time, like something that had been missing from the walls for years had suddenly briefly returned. Elias looked at his eggs. He didn't say anything, but he ate the whole plate. November moved toward December. The cold deepened, and the days shortened, and the work on the ranch changed character less about moving cattle across open range, and more about keeping everything alive through what was shaping up to be a serious winter. Feed needed stacking, fences needed checking, the water troughs needed breaking twice a day because they were icing over in the night. Elias worked from before sunrise to after sunset, the way he always did in the season's worst weeks. And when he came in each evening, there was heat in the kitchen and something on the stove, and the sound of Clara's voice somewhere in the house. She had a habit of talking to herself when she worked. Not in a distracted, absent way, in an engaged way, like she was working something through out loud, and didn't mind who heard the process. He caught pieces of it when he passed the kitchen doorway. Arguments she was assembling. Points she was sharpening. Legal language that told him she'd spent considerably more time studying the workings of territorial courts than most people her age. The third time he paused outside the kitchen to listen, he realized he'd done it 3 times in a row. He made himself walk past, but he remembered what he'd heard. It was Billy who broke first. Billy Marsh was 19 and had the particular quality of honest people everywhere. He could not hold a question indefinitely. It built up inside him like steam in a closed pot, and eventually it came out whether he wanted it to or not. He caught Clara in the barn one afternoon when she was feeding apples to Elias's gray mare Duchess, a habit she'd developed sometime in the second week, and that Duchess had developed strong opinions about continuing. "Miss Bennett," Billy said. "Billy." She offered the apple without looking up. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." He leaned against the stall. "How long are you planning to stay?" Clara looked at the horse. "A while." "How long is a while?" "Longer than a night. Shorter than forever." She scratched Duchess's nose. "Why?" Billy was quiet for a moment, a rare condition for him. Then, "The boss hasn't fired anyone since you got here." Clara looked at him. "He fired 2 men in September," Billy said, "for less than nothing. Tom says he fires somebody every fall because the winters make him mean." A pause. "He hasn't fired anybody this year." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. "He fired people for less than nothing," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What's less than nothing?" Billy thought about it. "Well, one of them forgot to latch the south gate twice. The other one actually, I'm not even sure what the other one did. Something about a fence post in the wrong place." "Ah," Clara said. "Tom says he's different when you're in the house." Clara turned back to Duchess. "Tom talks too much." "Tom talks exactly the right amount," Billy said cheerfully. "He just has good timing." A beat. "Miss Bennett, do you like it here?" She was quiet for long enough that he probably thought she hadn't heard him. "I like Duchess," she said finally. Billy grinned. "That's a start." Tom Reeves found Elias in the equipment shed that same evening sharpening a blade that didn't particularly need sharpening. Tom leaned against the workbench and watched him for a while without speaking, which was something Tom could do for an impressive length of time when he decided the situation called for it. "Say it," Elias said. "Didn't say I had anything to say." "You've been standing there for 4 minutes making that face." "I have one face. You have approximately 6. That one means you've decided something and you're waiting for me to ask." Elias kept sharpening. "So ask." Tom crossed his arms. "I wasn't going to ask you anything. I was going to tell you something." "Then tell it." "She came here with documents." Tom's voice was matter-of-fact, not gossipy. "Legal documents. I helped her get them out of her bag to dry them when she first arrived. They got wet in the storm. She was worried about the ink running. I didn't read them. He paused. But I saw enough to know they're real, and they're serious. Elias set down the blade, turned to look at him. She'd tell you what they are? Tom asked. Yes. Tom nodded slowly. She's not just passing through. No, she's fighting something big. Yes. And it's going to come here. Probably. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, you going to help her? The question hung in the cold air of the shed. Elias picked up the blade again, turned it over in his hands once. I'm going to feed my cattle, he said, and fix my fences, and run my ranch. He looked at Tom. What else happens here is what happens here. Tom unfolded his arms. That's a yes, he said. That's none of your business. That is also a yes. Tom headed for the door, stopped. She fixed Daniel's winter coat. He had a tear in the lining he's been wearing around for 2 years. She fixed it without being asked, without saying anything about it. Just left it on his bunk. Tom's voice was quiet. Daniel doesn't let most people touch his things. Elias didn't respond. Just thought you should know, Tom said. He left. Elias sat with the blade in his hands for a long time. The first real confrontation came on a Thursday. Not Richard Hale. Not anything Elias had been bracing for. It came in the form of Mrs. Adeline Holt, wife of the Holt Valley preacher, who arrived in a buckboard wagon with her daughter Grace, and the particular expression of a woman who has appointed herself the moral authority of an entire community and intends to exercise that authority thoroughly. She knocked on the front door in the middle of the afternoon. Clara answered it. Elias heard the conversation from the other side of the house, where he'd come in to get warm and had stayed when he heard the knock. Not out of nosiness, he told himself, but out of the reasonable preparedness of a man who knew trouble came in many forms. You must be the new housekeeper, Mrs. Holt said. Her voice was the kind of pleasant that isn't pleasant at all. Clara Bennett, Clara said. Can I help you? We've come to call on Mr. Carter. Is he available? I can check. Would you like to come in? A pause. The kind of pause that communicates an entire social evaluation happening behind a polite face. We'll wait here, Mrs. Holt said. Elias was already in the hallway. He opened the front door wider and looked at Adeline Holt and her daughter Grace, who had the decency to look slightly embarrassed about the whole enterprise. Adeline, he said, what can I do for you? We came to check on you, Elias. We've heard you've had changes out here. The kitchen curtains are new, he said, and we replanted the herb garden. Mrs. Holt's pleasant expression tightened by a fraction. We've heard you've taken in a young woman. I've employed a housekeeper. Elias. She lowered her voice slightly, not for privacy, for effect. You know how things look. How do they look? A widower, alone, a young woman, no chaperone, no... Mrs. Holt! Clara's voice came from directly behind Elias, calm and clear. He hadn't heard her follow him. I apologize for interrupting, but I want to make sure I understand your concern correctly. Adeline Holt blinked. You're concerned, Clara continued, that Mr. Carter's reputation may suffer because he has employed a housekeeper. Is that right? Mrs. Holt's mouth opened. It's a question of, because I want to reassure you, Clara went on pleasantly, that Mr. Carter has been nothing but completely professional. He provides room and board in exchange for cooking and housekeeping services, which I provide, and the arrangement is entirely straightforward and appropriate. She paused. I'm also happy to provide you with character references if that would help. I can write to the Bennett family of Caldwell, though I should warn you, my Uncle Edmund may be too busy managing other people's money to respond promptly. Something shifted in Mrs. Holt's expression. She couldn't quite locate what had just happened to her, only that the conversation had gone somewhere she hadn't planned for it to go. Well, she said, as long as things are proper. Entirely proper, Clara said. Would you like to come in? I made ginger cake this morning. Grace Holt made a sound that was very nearly a laugh and converted it not entirely successfully into a cough. Mrs. Holt looked at Clara, looked at Elias, looked at Clara again. "Perhaps another time," she said. They left. Elias stood in the doorway and watched the buckboard roll down the drive. Then he turned. Clara was already walking back toward the kitchen. "The Bennett family of Caldwell," he said. "I didn't lie," she said without stopping. "I said I could write to them. I didn't say they'd respond helpfully. You also implied your uncle was a criminal to the preacher's wife. I implied he was busy. She drew her own conclusions." Clara disappeared into the kitchen. "The ginger cake is on the counter if you want some." Elias stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and cut himself a piece of cake. It was very good. He didn't mention that. He ate the whole piece, standing at the counter, and then he went back outside, and he didn't look back at the window, where if he had looked he would have seen Clara watching the road in the direction Richard Hale had ridden away, her expression no longer carrying any relief at all. The piano was the thing that changed everything. It was an upright old with 3 keys that stuck, and one that had been silent since before Margaret died. It sat in the corner of the front room, under a canvas drop-cloth that had been there so long it had become part of the furniture. Something Elias looked past, rather than at every day, without deciding to look past it. It had simply become invisible, the way things do when looking at them costs more than you want to spend. He found out about Clara and the piano the way he found out about most things he heard at first. He was crossing the yard toward the house at 8:30 in the evening, later than usual, after an hour spent in the cold barn with a mare who was having difficulty with her foal and had needed company more than intervention. He was tired, and his hands were cold, and he was thinking about coffee. And then he heard it. Not music exactly, not a song, just notes, careful, tentative single notes being pressed in sequence. Testing. Finding. The way someone touches something fragile to understand it before they commit. He stopped walking. The notes came again. A small phrase. 4 notes, then a 5th. Then silence. Then the same phrase again, slightly adjusted. She was figuring out which keys still worked. Elias stood in the cold and listened. He had not uncovered that piano. She had found it herself and uncovered it herself, and was sitting in his front room in the dark, with his dead wife's piano playing 4-note phrases into the air, like she was having a quiet conversation with something that hadn't spoken in years. He should have said something. Should have told her that piano wasn't hers to touch. Should have felt something hard and protective rise up in him the way it did whenever anyone got close to the things that still hurt. Instead, he stood outside in the cold and listened. The 4 notes became 5. Became a phrase he recognized distantly from a long time ago. Something Margaret had played on Sunday mornings when the light came through the east window and the whole house had the particular peace that comes before a day decides what it's going to be. He didn't go inside. He stood there until the music stopped, until the lamp in the front window went dark, until Clara had gone to bed and the house was quiet again. Then he went in. He stood in the doorway of the front room. The canvas drop-cloth was folded neatly on the chair beside the piano. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to bed. In the morning he did not replace the drop-cloth. Clara noticed. He knew she noticed because her eyes went to the piano when she passed the doorway and then went quickly to something else, and she didn't say anything. He didn't say anything either. But that afternoon, while Clara was out helping Billy carry feed to the north pasture, Elias went to the front room and sat at the piano and pressed the stuck keys one by one until he understood what they needed. The first 2 needed tuning. The third needed the hammer mechanism adjusted. And then he went to the equipment shed and found what he needed and spent 2 hours doing what he could. He was not a piano repairman, but he was a man who could fix most things if he understood how they worked. When Clara came in from the cold that evening, she went to the front room first thing, not obviously, not directly, but he heard her stop in the doorway, and then he heard the sound of the previously silent key being pressed once softly. It rang clean. She pressed it again. He was in the kitchen. He didn't move. After a moment, she played the phrase from last night, the 4 notes, then the 5th. then further adding what the repaired key now allowed her to reach. It wasn't Margaret's song anymore. It was Clara's. Something new. Something careful and honest and a little tentative, and entirely its own. Elias sat in the kitchen and listened to it, and felt something in him shift that he didn't know how to name and wasn't sure he wanted to. The letter from his sister arrived the following week. Elias had one sibling, Ruth, younger by 4 years, married and living in Billings, a woman of considerable intelligence and absolutely no ability to mind her own business when she felt strongly about something. She wrote twice a year reliably, and her letters were always long and always direct, and always contained at least one observation that made him put the letter down and look at the wall for a minute. This letter arrived on a Wednesday. He read it at the kitchen table while Clara was making supper. He read the first 2 pages, which were about Ruth's children and her husband's business and the weather in Billings. He read the 3rd page. He put the letter down and looked at the wall. "Good news or bad news?" Clara asked. She hadn't looked up from the stove. "My sister wants to visit." "Is that bad news?" "It's complicated news." Clara looked at him now. "Because of me." It wasn't a question. She'd worked it out in the time it took him to say 4 words, which was entirely consistent with the way her mind worked. "She says she's heard from Tom Reeves's wife that I've hired a housekeeper," Elias said. "She says she's delighted. She says she can't wait to meet her." He folded the letter. "My sister's version of delighted means she is coming here with the specific intention of evaluating this situation from every possible angle." How long has she been doing that? Since she was 9. Clara almost smiled. When would she arrive? She says mid-December. That's 2 weeks. I know. Do you want me to? She stopped, reconsidered the sentence. Would it help if I made myself scarce while she's here? Elias looked at her. The question she'd been careful not to ask. Do you want me to leave? Lived right underneath the question she had asked, and they both knew it. No, he said. He picked up his coffee. Ruth will make up her mind about whatever she's going to make up her mind about regardless of what she does or doesn't see. Making yourself scarce would just make her imagine something worse. Something worse than the truth. My sister has an active imagination. Clara turned back to the stove. I'll make sure the guest room is ready. She'll stay at the hotel in Holt Valley. She always does. She sounds like someone who likes to be able to leave quickly. She likes to be able to make an exit, Elias corrected. There's a difference. She's never left anywhere before she was ready to. Clara glanced back at him. There was something in her expression, a recognition, a small mirroring of something she understood from the inside. I know someone like that, she said. He met her eyes. Neither of them pointed out that she was describing herself. The second confrontation with Richard Hale happened without warning. Elias was in Holt Valley to pick up supplies. Clara had given him a list of specific items organized by store with the quantities written precisely because that was how she did everything, and he had the wagon loaded and was making the last stop at the general store when he heard his name. He turned. Richard Hale was standing in the street with 2 other men, both of them bigger than Hale, both of them with the professional stillness of people who got paid to stand next to people and looked like they were willing to do things. Mr. Carter, Hale said. Same smooth voice, same settled confidence. A word. Elias tied off the horse. 1 word. Hale smiled. The smile didn't reach anything. I want to be direct with you. The woman you're harboring is involved in a legal matter with her family. A serious legal matter. Her presence in your home puts you in a complicated position. She's my housekeeper, Elias said. She's a woman making claims against a family of considerable resources. Hale took 1 step closer. I want you to understand what that means. The Bennetts of Caldwell have lawyers, Mr. Carter, good ones. If they decide to pursue this, and they will, anything associated with Clara Bennett becomes part of that pursuit. He paused. Your land, your ranch, your livelihood. Elias looked at him, then at the 2 men behind him. "You're threatening me," he said. "I'm informing you." Hale spread his hands, reasonable and generous. "I have nothing against you personally. You seem like a decent man who took in a stranger out of good intentions. I'm simply making sure you understand the full picture before this goes further. And if I tell you she's not here, then I might believe you." A pause. "Or I might ask around. People talk in small towns. I find they're generally very helpful when asked the right questions by the right people." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Those documents she's carrying," he said, "they bother your employer quite a bit." Something moved behind Hale's even expression. Too fast to read, but definitely there. "I don't know what documents you're referring to," Hale said. "Sure you don't." Elias untied his horse. "I'll pass along your concern." He climbed into the wagon. "Though I should tell you I don't scare easy. I built everything I have on ground that tried to kill me for 3 years before it agreed to let me stay." He picked up the reins. "The ground won that argument, Mr. Hale. Not me." He drove away. In the wagon on the way home, the cold air working at his face, Elias thought about what Hale had said. Not the threat he'd been threatened before, and it had never been productive information, but the speed with which the man's expression had changed when he mentioned the documents. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Hale knew exactly what documents Clara had, which meant Edmund Bennett knew, which meant they'd been looking for those documents before Clara had ever walked out of Caldwell. And if they'd been looking for them, if Edmund Bennett had known long enough in advance that Clara was building a case, then someone close to her had been reporting to him. Elias drove home faster than he'd planned. He came into the kitchen without taking off his coat. Clara looked at him once and put down what she was holding. "He found you in town," she said. "Yes." "What did he say?" Elias told her. All of it directly, without softening anything. Clara listened without interrupting. Her face was careful and still in the way it went when she was absorbing information that required immediate reprocessing of everything she'd previously understood. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Someone told him about the documents," she said. "Seems like, before I left Caldwell." Her voice was flat, not devastated, furious in the quiet, controlled way of someone who has had their trust broken in a calculated way and is already deciding what to do about it. "There are only 2 people who knew I had them. One is a man named Arthur Gaines. He's a retired land surveyor. He helped me access the county records." She stopped. "The other is a woman I thought was my friend." She said it without letting it shake her. But Elias heard what was underneath it, the particular human wreckage of having trusted someone who sold you. "Her name?" he asked. Clara looked at him. "Why?" "Because knowing matters." A long pause. "Catherine Marsh." She held his gaze. "She was my closest friend for 6 years." Elias said nothing. He took off his coat, hung it on the hook, turned back to Clara. "Those documents," he said. "How many copies do you have?" She blinked, recalibrated. "1. The originals." "Where?" "In my bag, under the floorboard in the spare room." She'd hidden them herself without being asked the first week. "We need a second copy," he said. "And we need it somewhere they can't find in this house." He looked at her steadily. "Tom Reeves's wife is in Billings visiting her sister until February. Tom's wife has a sister who is married to a bank clerk." A pause. "A bank vault is harder to get into than a floorboard." Clara stared at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about this since the day Hale first rode up to my gate." Something moved in her expression. Something she didn't try to control quickly enough to hide it from him. Not just gratitude. Something rawer than that. The look of someone who has been fighting alone for a very long time and has just registered for the first time that they might not be anymore. She blinked it away. "Tom's wife's sister's bank," she said steadily. "Can Tom be trusted with that?" Tom Reeves is the most trustworthy man I've ever known in my life, Elias said, and he already knows most of it anyway. Clara nodded slowly. All right. All right. She met his eyes. All right, she said again. And this time it meant something larger than agreement. Outside somewhere down the road, Richard Hale was riding back toward wherever he came from. He would return. He would come with more people and more pressure and more of Edmund Bennett's money and the practiced confidence of a man who had never yet encountered an obstacle that couldn't be removed. But tonight in this kitchen, Clara Bennett was not running. She was standing still. And so was Elias Carter. And in the cold dark outside the window, the winter pressed close against the glass, and inside the warmth held. Tom rode out to Billings the next morning before sunrise. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask for details he hadn't been given. Elias handed him a sealed envelope containing Clara's copied documents. She had spent 4 hours the night before making the copies by hand at the kitchen table, writing quickly and precisely in the lamplight, while Elias sat across from her and didn't tell her to go to bed, and Tom put the envelope inside his coat, saddled his horse, and left without a word about it. That was Tom Reeves. Clara watched him ride out from the kitchen window. He didn't even ask what was in it, she said. No. Most people would ask. Tom's not most people. Elias poured coffee into his cup. Tom's been with me long enough to know that when I hand him something without explaining it, the explanation will come when it's needed, and not before. Clara turned from this window. She looked like she hadn't slept, which she hadn't. He'd heard the lamp in the kitchen stay lit until past midnight, heard the scratch of her pen on paper, heard the occasional pause that meant she was checking her own work. Her eyes had the particular quality of someone running entirely on will and caffeine and stubbornness. You should sleep, he said. I'm fine. You wrote for 4 hours. I've done more on less. She sat down at the table. Besides, I have breakfast to make. I can make breakfast. She looked at him. He looked back. Sit down, she said. I'll make breakfast. He sat down. Some arguments weren't worth having. He was learning which ones those were. Ruth Carter arrived on a Tuesday 12 days after the letter. She came in a hired buggy from Holt Valley, wearing a green wool coat and an expression that managed to communicate both genuine affection and active assessment simultaneously, a combination only Ruth had ever been able to pull off in his experience, and she'd been doing it since she was 12 years old. She came through the front door, kissed Elias on the cheek without breaking stride, handed him her bag, walked directly to the kitchen doorway, and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for 4 full seconds. Then Ruth said, You're younger than I expected. You're exactly what I expected, Clara said. Ruth blinked. Then she turned to Elias with an expression that said several things at once, the loudest of which was, She'll do. Coffee, Ruth said. And then you're both going to tell me everything. What followed was the most unusual 2 hours Elias could remember in recent experience. Ruth sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee and asked questions. Specific targeted questions, not the social kind designed to make people comfortable, but the kind designed to actually extract information. She asked Clara about Caldwell, about the estate, about the documents, about Edmund Bennett, about the circuit court schedule, about Richard Hale. She asked without apology and without softening, and without the particular kind of concern that turns into condescension. Clara answered everything. Elias sat and watched them, and said almost nothing. He hadn't seen Clara talk this much at one time. Not about this, not about any of it. With him, she was always measured, deliberate, giving exactly what was needed and keeping the rest. With Ruth, she was still precise, still organized, but the walls were lower. Something about Ruth's directness matched something in Clara that his own quietness didn't. The account ledgers, Ruth said. Can you prove the transfers are fraudulent, not just irregular fraudulent? A judge will need specific language. Arthur Gaines has filed an affidavit with the county recorder's office in Caldwell, Clara said. It documents the transfer dates against the original property survey records. The numbers don't match by a factor of 3. She paused. The problem is, the county recorder is Edmund's brother-in-law. Ruth's eyes sharpened. So the affidavit may not survive until March. That's my concern. Can Gaines testify in person? He's 71 and not in good health. He said he would try. Ruth tapped her finger against the table. Once. Twice. You need a second witness. Someone with legal standing who can speak to the property records independently. I know. There's a man in Billings, a land commissioner, James Aldridge. He was involved in the original Bennett estate survey in 1871. If those records were falsified after the fact, he would know. Ruth looked at her. Have you contacted him? Clara went very still. I didn't know he was still in practice, she said. He retired from the commission 2 years ago. But retired is not dead, and a retired land commissioner's testimony carries significant weight in territorial court. Ruth looked at Elias. Do you know Aldridge? By name, Elias said. He came through Holt Valley maybe 8 years ago. Land dispute between 2 ranchers. Can you get a letter to him? Elias looked at Clara. Clara was looking at Ruth with the expression of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about an unfamiliar situation. You know an awful lot about territorial land law, Clara said slowly. Ruth picked up her coffee. My husband is a property attorney, she said. I've been listening to him talk about it for 14 years. I also have a very good memory and a genuine personal interest in land fraud cases. A pause. My father-in-law lost 200 acres to a falsified survey in 1869. We don't take land fraud lightly in this family. Clara sat back in her chair. Your brother never mentioned that, she said. My brother doesn't talk about things that aren't his to tell. Ruth glanced at Elias. It's his most irritating quality, and also the reason I trust him completely. Elias said nothing. But something moved in his chest, some recognition that his sister sitting in his kitchen, talking to the woman who had walked in out of a November storm, had just put her finger on something he'd never quite heard said out loud before. Ruth stayed for 3 days. In those 3 days, she reorganized Clara's entire legal strategy into something considerably more structured than what Clara had assembled alone, wrote 2 letters to James Aldridge in Billings, using her husband's professional letterhead, which she had apparently brought with her anticipating exactly this possibility, and personally drove to Holt Valley to have a conversation with the local judge that she declined to detail, but which resulted in the judge sending a letter of his own to the circuit court in Billings, referencing the Bennett estate case. She also, on the second evening, sat with Elias on the porch after Clara had gone inside, and said what she'd been holding since she arrived. She's not what you think she is, Ruth said. I don't think she's anything, Elias said. That is demonstrably untrue. He looked at his sister. Elias. Her voice went quieter. Not softer. Ruth didn't really do softer, but quieter, which with her meant the same thing. I have been watching you for 3 days. You listen for her when she's in another room. You hand her coffee before she asks for it. You fixed that piano. She paused. You didn't fix that piano for yourself. It needed fixing. It needed fixing 4 years ago. He didn't answer. I'm not telling you to do anything, Ruth said. I'm not telling you it's too soon or it's not too soon or any of that. Margaret has been gone 5 years, and what you do with that is your own business. She looked at the dark yard. I'm just telling you that you fixed the piano. Elias was quiet for a long time. She's fighting a battle, he said finally. She doesn't need anything complicated from me on top of it. Has she said that? She hasn't said anything. That's different from it not being true. Ruth considered this. She's very careful, she said. Not closed careful. There's a difference. Closed people push you away. Careful people just don't come forward until they're sure the ground will hold. She stood up. Make sure the ground holds, Elias, that's all. She went inside. Elias sat on the porch in the December cold for a long time after that. Ruth left on a Thursday morning, and the house felt different after, not emptier exactly, but like something that had been building pressure for 3 days had finally found a place to release. Clara moved through the morning quietly doing the work she always did, but there was something different in her too, something more settled, as though Ruth's visit had confirmed a calculation she'd been running for weeks. At midday, she came to find Elias in the barn. "I want to tell you something," she said. He kept his hands on the harness he was working on. "Go ahead." "When I came here, I told you I had a plan." She stood in the middle of the barn with her coat on and her hands in her pockets and her chin level. The plan was to survive until March, file with the court, and move on. That was the whole of it. Get through, get out, start somewhere else. A pause. "I didn't account for—" She stopped. "For what?" She looked at him directly. "For this being a place I didn't want to leave." The barn was quiet except for the horses. Elias set down the harness. "Clara, I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to feel anything or do anything. I just thought you should know, in the interest of honesty which you've been extending to me consistently since I arrived, that my intentions have shifted." Her jaw was set, her voice was level, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was most certain and most frightened at the same time. "I would like to stay, after March, if there's a reason to stay." He looked at her. "Is that—" She caught herself. Recalibrated. "Is that something you'd consider?" Elias picked up the harness again. Worked it for a moment. "I fixed the piano," he said. Clara blinked. "I know." "I don't fix things I don't plan to use." A silence. Something moved through Clara's face, through the careful control of it, and for just a moment it was all visible. Everything she'd been holding at the right distance. The relief and the fear and the particular fragile hope of someone who has been disappointed enough times to know exactly how much hope costs. Then she nodded. Once. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She turned and walked back toward the house. Elias watched her go. He went back to the harness. He was smiling. Not a big smile, not the kind that required an audience. The small private kind that a man allows himself when nobody is watching, and something he'd stopped expecting has quietly, without announcement, begun. The third week of December brought 3 things in rapid succession. The first was a letter from James Aldridge in Billings responding to Ruth's correspondence. He remembered the Bennett estate survey. He had concerns about subsequent modifications to the recorded documents. He was willing to speak to the matter in the appropriate venue provided his health allowed the travel. Clara read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then she put it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. "We have him," she said. "Maybe," Elias said. "We have him," she said again. "Certain." He didn't argue. When Clara said something that way, he'd learned she'd already done the math. The second thing was a visit from Deputy Harold Cates of Holt Valley, who came out to the ranch on a gray afternoon and asked with genuine professional awkwardness whether Elias was aware that a formal inquiry had been filed with the county regarding one Clara Bennett and whether she was on the premises under any kind of legal arrangement. Elias handed him the paper documenting Clara's employment. Cates looked at it, looked at Elias, looked at Clara, who had appeared in the doorway with the same pleasant directness she'd applied to Mrs. Holt. "Is this satisfactory, Deputy?" she asked. Cates looked at the paper again. "It's yes, ma'am, for now." "Good. Would you like coffee before you ride back? It's cold." Cates took the coffee. He also, before he left, told Elias quietly that the inquiry had come from outside the county, from Caldwell specifically, and that whoever had filed it had spent some money doing so. "They're escalating," Elias told Clara after Cates was gone. "I know." She was washing the coffee cups, her back to him. "March feels further away than it did last week. It's the same distance. Distance changes depending on what's chasing you." He couldn't argue with that either. Does she say? The third thing was Daniel Crow. Daniel came to Elias on a Thursday evening with his hat in his hands, which was Daniel's equivalent of someone else kneeling, and told him that two men had ridden up to the north fence line that afternoon while Daniel was checking the wire. They hadn't crossed onto Carterland. They'd just sat there for 20 minutes on the other side of the fence and watched the ranch house. "Watching for what?" Elias asked. "For her," Daniel said. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way Daniel said things, simply as fact, without editorializing. "How many?" "Two I saw. Could be more further back." Elias was quiet. "They crossed the line." "No." "They say anything?" "No. Just watched." "All right." Elias put his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You see them again, you come to me first. You don't engage. You don't confront. You come to me." Daniel nodded, put his hat back on, left. Elias stood alone in the equipment shed for a minute. They were watching the ranch, not moving on it, not yet, still in the pressure phase, making sure Elias and Clara knew they were there, making sure the knowledge of being watched did its work. He went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table with her documents spread out, the lamp pulled close. She looked up when he came in. He told her about the men at the fence line. She listened to the whole thing. Her face went through nothing. No fear, no panic, no dramatic reaction. Just the focused stillness of someone absorbing an operational update. "They won't move on the property," she said. "Not yet. They can't legally. I'm employed here, the paperwork is filed. They need something to shift the situation before they can change their approach." "What would shift it? If I did something that gave them legal standing, made a claim I can't support, communicated something they could use?" She paused. "Or if you decided the risk wasn't worth it and asked me to leave?" He looked at her across the table. "That second option," he said. "What do you think the odds are of it?" She held his gaze. Something in her face was very still and very serious, and just slightly something else. "I've revised my estimate downward considerably," she said. "Good." She went back to her documents. He sat down across from her, pulled out his account ledgers, and worked. Neither of them mentioned the men at the fence line again that night, but neither of them went to bed early either, and sometime past 10 o'clock, when the lamp was burning low, and Clara's pen had slowed, she looked up and said quietly, "Elias." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "I told you to stop thanking me." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm going to keep doing it anyway." He looked at her. "Fair enough," he said. The crisis came 9 days before Christmas. It came fast, the way crises do when they've been building long enough, not with warning, not with escalation, but all at once, already at full force, before anyone had time to prepare for it. A rider came from Holt Valley at mid-morning. Young kid, one of the stable hands from the hotel, riding hard. He brought a message for Clara. The message was from Arthur Gaines. Clara read it. She put it on the table. She stood very still. "What?" Elias said. "Arthur Gaines is dead," she said. "He died 4 days ago. The county recorder's office in Caldwell says his affidavit was filed incorrectly and has been removed from the record." Her voice was flat and very controlled. "My uncle's lawyers have filed a counter-petition with the circuit court, claiming the original documents I have are forgeries." She paused. "They're requesting the circuit judge reject my case before it's even heard." Elias looked at her. "Can they do that?" "They can request it." She sat down. Her hands were on the table, both of them pressed flat. "Whether the judge agrees depends on what evidence comes with the request." "What evidence?" "Testimony." She looked up. "Character testimony. From people in Caldwell willing to say I was unstable, erratic, someone who would falsify documents." Her voice didn't waver. "My uncle has had 11 years to make sure the right people believe the right things about me." The kitchen was very quiet. "Aldridge," Elias said. "He hasn't confirmed he can travel. His health? I'll go to Billings. She looked at him. Elias? I'll go to Billings, and I'll talk to Aldridge in person. He said it the way he said things when they were already decided. A letter takes time. A conversation takes an afternoon. You can't leave the ranch right now. The winter... Tom can run the ranch for 3 days. The men at the fence line. Daniel can watch the fence line. He leaned forward slightly. Clara, they filed to have your case thrown out before it's heard. If that succeeds, everything you've collected for 2 years disappears. You need Aldridge, and you need him confirmed, not pending. She stared at him. This isn't your fight, she said. The words came out rough-edged, like they cost her something. You're on my property and in my employ, he said. What happens to you has consequences for this ranch. That makes it partly my concern. He paused. And you know that's not the only reason. Silence. Clara looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the documents spread between them. He won't talk to a stranger, she said. Aldridge, he's careful. He doesn't, Write me a letter of introduction. Elias stood up. Tell him who I am and why I'm coming. I'll carry it with me. She looked up at him. Her eyes were doing the thing again, the complicated thing. The thing where everything was right there on the surface, and she couldn't quite get it back under control and had stopped entirely trying. You'd do that, she said. Not a question. Just go to Billings, for this. I'd do considerably more than that, he said quietly. The words landed in the air between them. He hadn't planned to say that. It had come out the way honest things do when you've stopped spending energy on keeping them back plain and direct and entirely true. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I'll write the letter, she said. Good. He went to get his coat. He was at the door when she said his name again. He turned. She had the pen in her hand, but she wasn't writing yet. She was looking at him with the kind of expression that belongs to people who have learned not to rely on anyone and are encountering against all previous evidence a reason to reconsider that policy. Come back, she said. 3 words, flat on the surface, carrying everything underneath. I'll be gone 3 days, he said. I know. She held his gaze. Come back. He looked at her for a moment. I always come back, he said. It's my ranch. But they both knew that wasn't what she meant, and they both knew it wasn't what he meant either. He was gone 2 days. The 3rd day, he didn't come back. Clara kept the house running. She cooked, she cleaned, she did the work. She talked to Billy and Daniel and Tom with the same steady competence she always had. She checked the document copies she still kept under the floorboard. She wrote 3 pages of notes for the circuit court filing. She did not watch the road. She checked the road, once in the morning, the way she did. And then she got on with things. But on the 3rd evening, when the sun went down and the road stayed empty, she stood at the kitchen window longer than once. Tom came in for coffee at 7:30. He stood at the counter and didn't say anything for a minute. Roads from Billings can get bad this time of year, he said. I know, Clara said. He's not someone who gets in trouble he can't get out of. I know that too. She turned from the window. Tom, if something happened. Nothing happened. Tom's voice was calm and absolute. He's fine. He's just late. She looked at him. Tom met her eyes steadily. He's fine, he said again. And when he gets back, you're going to feel embarrassed for worrying this much. He'd find that hilarious, by the way. Something in Clara's chest released just slightly. Not because she fully believed it, but because Tom did, and Tom had been right about things consistently enough to have earned partial credit. He'd better not find it hilarious, she said. Tom almost smiled. No, he agreed. Probably not. He finished his coffee and left. Clara stood in the kitchen. She went to the piano, sat down, played the phrase she'd been building for weeks, not tentative now, not exploratory, but full and certain, the whole shape of it clear. The notes went up into the quiet house and spread out through the empty rooms and filled the space where there had been silence for 5 years. She played until she heard the sound of a horse on the road. She stopped, listened, went to the front window. One rider, coming fast from the direction of Holt Valley. She had the front door open before he'd reached the gate. Elias rode into the yard and pulled up and looked at her standing in the doorway in the light from the hall lamp. He looked tired. He looked cold. His coat was dusty with road, and his face had 3 days of stubble, and he looked... She thought he looked like exactly what he was, which was a man who had ridden to Billings in December, and back in 3 days for a woman who had shown up on his porch asking for shelter. He swung down from his horse. "Well," she said. "Aldridge will testify," Elias said. "In person. He'll make the travel." He tied the horse to the post. He also showed me the original survey records he kept personal copies of from 1871. The modifications in the county record are visible. Someone changed the measurements on the plat map after it was filed. Clara gripped the doorframe. "That's fraud on a filed government document," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "That's not just a property dispute anymore. That's a federal matter." "Yes," Elias said. "That's what Aldridge said." He walked toward her, stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. "You're going to win this," he said, simple, direct, like something already decided. Clara looked at him in the lamplight. She had been fighting for 2 years. Alone, and then less alone, and now with Tom and Ruth and Aldridge, and this man standing at the bottom of her porch steps in December, looking at her like the outcome was already determined, and she just hadn't caught up to it yet. "Come inside," she said. "You need food, and you need coffee, and you need to tell me everything Aldridge said in the exact order he said it." Elias came up the steps. He was almost past her in the doorway when she put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She was looking at him with the walls all the way down for the first time since she'd arrived. Not strategic, not careful, not measured. Just Clara direct and honest and completely undefended. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "I told you to stop thanking me," he said. "I know. You keep doing it anyway. I told you I would." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once the nod of a man who has lost an argument he didn't entirely want to win, and went inside. Clara followed him. She closed the door behind her. And outside whatever was pressing against the walls of Carter Ranch in the dark. Richard Hale, Edmund Bennett, the men at the fence line, the counter petition. All of it stayed where it was. Outside. And inside the kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning, and somewhere in the house the piano was still holding the last note Clara had played before she heard his horse on the road. It was still enough to carry. Edmund Bennett arrived in Holt Valley on the 14th of January. Not Richard Hale, not lawyers, not hired men on the fence line. Edmund Bennett himself. Elias found out the way he found out most things in this valley. Tom heard it from the feed store owner, who heard it from the hotel clerk, who had personally checked in a man from Caldwell traveling with 2 attorneys and a private investigator, and who had requested the largest suite in the building, and paid for a week in advance. Tom came to Elias in the barn at noon. "He's here," Tom said. Elias set down what he was holding. "Since when?" "Last night. Rode in on the evening stage." Tom's voice was measured. "He's not hiding. He took breakfast in the hotel dining room this morning. Talked to at least 3 people that I know of." "Who?" "Judge Pearson, the county clerk, and Reverend Holt." Elias was quiet for a moment. Reverend Holt meant Adeline Holt, which meant the preacher's wife, who had already formed strong opinions about Clara Bennett and the Carter Ranch, was now in conversation with the man who wanted those opinions to work in his favor. "He's building a local record," Elias said. "That's what it looks like." "How long before he comes here?" Tom considered. "Man like that doesn't come to you. He makes you come to him." A pause. "Or he makes the situation come to you." Elias nodded. "Tell Daniel to keep eyes on the north fence. Tell Billy to stay close to the house." He picked up what he'd been working on. "And don't tell Clara yet." Tom looked at him. "She'll find out," Tom said. "I know. I'll tell her tonight." He met Tom's eyes. "I want to have more information first. Right now, all we know is he's here. That's not enough." Tom nodded once and left. Elias stood alone in the barn. Edmund Bennett in Holt Valley, in person. A man who had managed a stolen estate for 11 years without ever needing to show his face didn't travel 400 miles in January unless something had shifted the calculation enough to require his personal attention. Aldridge, Elias thought. The letter from Aldridge to the circuit court. That was what had shifted it. Edmund Bennett had found out that James Aldridge was going to testify, and he'd come to do something about it before March. He told Clara at supper. He waited until Billy and Daniel had eaten and gone back to the bunkhouse. Tom stayed the way Tom did when he understood a conversation was going to require witness rather than privacy. Clara set the last plates on the table and sat down and looked at Elias's face and said, "Tell me." He told her. She listened to the whole thing without interruption. Her fork stayed on the table. Her coffee stayed untouched. She was absolutely still in the way she went still when she was running every variable at the same time, building the picture fast and getting ahead of the problem. When he finished, she said, "Aldridge. That's my read. He found out about the testimony, and he came himself because a letter from his lawyers won't be enough to stop it." Her voice was flat and fast. "He needs something that discredits Aldridge directly, or something that discredits me so thoroughly that the judge won't hear the case at all. Which means he's going to try both." She picked up her fork, put it down again. "The Reverend and his wife Edmund will feed them something specific, something that sounds credible. Then Adeline Holt starts talking, and the whole county hears it before I have a chance to respond." She looked at Elias. "What did he tell them?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." She said it without desperation, direct the way she said everything. "Find out today if you can. Whatever story he's planting, I need to know it before it spreads any further." Tom cleared his throat. "The hotel clerk's wife is Alice Fenner. She sits next to Adeline Holt at the church sewing circle." He paused. "My wife plays cards with Alice Fenner's sister every Thursday." Both Elias and Clara looked at him. Tom raised his hands slightly. "I'm just noting that information travels in specific channels, and some of those channels are accessible." "Thursday is tomorrow," Clara said. "Yes, it is," Tom agreed. Elias looked at Tom. Tom looked back at him with the complete serenity of a man who knows exactly what he's just offered. "Your wife's sister," Elias said, "is a very good card player," Tom said, "and an excellent listener." Thursday came and went. By Friday morning, Tom had a full account. Edmund Bennett had told Reverend Holt and his wife a story. It was a good story, smooth, detailed, internally consistent, and constructed entirely from real pieces, arranged in false order. It said that Clara Bennett was a disturbed young woman who had been stealing from her own family for years, that the documents she carried were her attempt to preemptively discredit her uncle before her own thefts were discovered, and that she had fled Caldwell specifically to avoid being charged with fraud. The story was designed with one purpose: to make every piece of real evidence Clara had look like the work of someone building a lie rather than proving a truth. Clara read Tom's written account at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "It's elegant," she said. Tom blinked. Elias looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "If I didn't know the truth, I'd believe it. He's taken every real element, my flight from Caldwell, the documents, Arthur Gaines, Aldridge, and reframed all of it as evidence of guilt rather than evidence of his guilt." She looked at Elias. "He's done this before. Not to me, to others. This is a practiced man." "He's also a man who just put his story in front of the wrong town," Elias said. She looked at him. "Holt Valley knows me," he said. "Not well, I don't give them a lot to work with. But they know me enough to know that I don't take people in carelessly. And whatever Adeline Holt thinks about the propriety of the situation, she doesn't think I'm a fool." He held her gaze. "What Bennett is asking them to believe is that I've been housing a con artist in my home for 2 months without noticing." Something shifted in Clara's expression. "People will believe what a persuasive man tells them," she said carefully. "Some will," he agreed, "but some won't, and the ones who won't are going to ask questions." He paused. "Let them ask. The answers are on our side." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You're not afraid of him," she said. It came out half observation, half question. "I'm not afraid of a man who has to build a fiction to win," Elias said. "The truth is slower, but it's sturdier. Edmund Bennett has had 11 years of nobody challenging his story. He doesn't know how to fight someone who has the facts. He has money. And we have Aldridge." Silence. Then Clara said very quietly, "We." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with that expression again, the undefended one, the one where everything was right there on the surface. "You said we," she said. He held her gaze. "I said we." She nodded once, looked back at the account Tom had written, her jaw set with the particular set of someone who has just finished being afraid and is transitioning into something harder and more useful. "All right," she said. "Then we need a plan." The plan had 3 parts. The first was Aldridge. They needed written confirmation from him, not just a letter of intent, but a sworn affidavit prepared in advance of his in-person testimony, filed directly with the circuit court in Billings, so that it existed on record before Edmund Bennett's lawyers could make another move to block it. Ruth's husband, contacted by telegraph through the Holt Valley office, agreed to file it on Aldridge's behalf through his own practice. The second was local standing. Elias spent the better part of 3 days visiting every person in Holt Valley he'd done business with, every rancher in the surrounding valley who knew him by more than name. He didn't go with arguments. He went with himself, the same quiet, direct man he'd always been, and he told them simply that the woman in his employ was being pursued by a dishonest man with money and lawyers and a convincing story, and that he personally vouched for the truth of what she was claiming. He didn't ask them to take sides. He asked them to reserve judgment until they heard both sides from someone besides Edmund Bennett. Some of them nodded and meant it. Some of them nodded and he couldn't tell. One of them, old Hector Vance, who had ranched the Eastern Valley for 40 years and had been cheated in a land deal once and never forgotten. It said, "This man who's after her. He from money." "Yes," Elias said. "Eastern money. Caldwell money." Hector Vance made a sound that communicated his opinion of Caldwell money comprehensively and without further elaboration. "You need a character witness. I'll stand up." Elias looked at him. "You don't know her." "I know you," Hector said. 30 years I've known you, boy. You don't back things you don't believe in." A pause. "I'll stand up." The third part of the plan was Clara herself. She went to see Judge Pearson. Elias offered to come with her. She said no. "He needs to see me alone," she said. "If you come, he sees someone being protected. If I walk in alone, he sees someone who doesn't need protection." He couldn't argue with the logic. She went alone on a Tuesday morning in her best dress, the one Ruth had quietly sent from Billings, along with a note that said, "For when it matters," and she sat across from Judge Pearson for 40 minutes and said what she had to say. Elias didn't know exactly what she said. She didn't tell him the full account. What she told him was that Pearson had listened without interrupting, had asked 4 specific questions about the documentation, and at the end had said, "Miss Bennett, I can't influence the circuit court's decision, but I can tell you that I do not find your account implausible." "That's not a ringing endorsement," Elias said. "From Pearson, that's practically a standing ovation," Clara said. And she almost smiled, and Elias thought not for the first time, and with increasing frequency, that the almost smile was somehow more interesting than the full one. It meant she was genuinely amused rather than performing amusement, and there was a difference he was becoming very familiar with. Edmund Bennett made his move on a Wednesday. Not at the ranch. At the telegraph office. Clara received a telegram. She brought it to Elias in the barn without saying anything, just handed it to him and he read it. It was from Edmund Bennett's attorneys. It informed Clara that her uncle had filed a formal petition with the Montana Territorial Court, claiming legal guardianship over her person and property on grounds of mental and emotional instability, effective pending a hearing. The petition, if granted, would render all documents she carried legally inadmissible as evidence and transfer management of any claim she held to her appointed guardian Edmund Bennett for an indefinite period. Elias read it once. Read it again. Guardianship, he said. It's not a new tactic, Clara said. Her voice was controlled, but he heard the thin edge underneath it. He threatened it when I was still in Caldwell. I didn't think he'd actually file it. It requires testimony from at least 2 physicians regarding competency. Who are his physicians? I don't know. Her jaw was tight. But I can guess what they'll say. Elias handed the telegram back. Ruth, he said. Clara looked at him. My sister's husband is a property attorney, Elias said. But Ruth knows people. She knows Billings. She knows who the reputable physicians are, and she knows the difference between a legitimate evaluation and a purchased opinion. He was already moving toward the house. We send a telegram today. Now. Clara grabbed his arm. He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, not the careful one, not the undefended one. Something between them, something that was afraid and determined at the same time, and was not trying to hide either. If the guardianship petition is granted, she said, even temporarily, it won't just stop the case. It could mean they have legal authority to remove me from this property. The words landed precisely. Elias looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. They're not removing you from this property, he said. Quiet, absolute. You can't promise that if a court order. Clara. He said her name the way he said things when they were decided, and the deciding was done. They're not removing you from this property. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand was still on his arm. He didn't move. Telegram Ruth, she said finally. That's what I said. She let go of his arm. They went inside. Ruth's response came in 2 parts. The first part arrived the next morning and contained 3 names. Physicians in Billings, with established reputations for independent evaluations, who were known to the legal community as people who could not be purchased. Ruth had already contacted all 3. One was available to travel to Holt Valley within the week to conduct a formal competency evaluation of Clara Bennett at Clara's request, making it a proactive voluntary evaluation rather than a reactive one, which Ruth's message explained was strategically significant. If the court sees she requested it herself, Ruth wrote, the petition loses half its force before it's heard. The second part of Ruth's response arrived by separate telegram an hour later and was addressed to Elias personally. It contained 4 words. Bring her to Billings. Elias read it. Read it again. He found Clara in the kitchen. My sister wants us in Billings, he said. Clara turned from the stove. Why? She didn't say why. She said bring her to Billings. He held up the telegram. When Ruth doesn't explain herself, it means the explanation is either too complicated for a telegram, or she wants to say it in person because she needs to watch your face when you hear it. Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel. When? She said soon. He paused. I think she means now. A silence. The ranch, Clara said. You can't just... Tom, he said. The hearing in March is 8 weeks away. If we leave now... Clara. He waited until she met his eyes. Ruth doesn't send a telegram like that unless it matters. She knows the ranch. She knows the timing. She knows all of it. He held her gaze. She said bring you to Billings, so I'm bringing you to Billings. Clara looked at him. She had the dish towel in her hands. She was twisting it slightly without noticing the only outward sign ever that something was happening underneath the surface. All right, she said. Pack for a week. 3 days, she said. Anything longer, and the ranch. Pack for a week, he said. We'll see. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to pack. They left the following morning before sunrise. Tom stood by the gate and watched them go, with the expression of a man who has already thought through every possible outcome and is at peace with all of them. Billy stood beside him and did not succeed in being at peace with any of them, but managed to keep this mostly internal, which was a significant personal achievement. Daniel said nothing, which was his way of saying everything was understood. The road to Billings was long and cold, and the wagon made it in a day and a half, stopping overnight at a way station outside Holt Valley, where Elias knew the owner and the room was clean and the stove worked. They ate at the small table in the way station's common room that evening, the two of them with nobody else around and the fire doing its work, and the kind of quiet that exists between two people who have already said most of the important things and are comfortable with what hasn't been said yet. Clara ate, drank her coffee, looked at the fire. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You always ask," he said. "You don't usually ask permission first." She looked at him. "Margaret," she said, "just the name." He didn't flinch. He'd stopped flinching at the sound of it, sometime in the last several weeks. When exactly, he couldn't pinpoint, but somewhere it had changed from something sharp to something he could hold steady. "What about her?" he said. "Do you think she'd mind?" Clara's voice was even. "All of this. Me in the house, the piano, the way things have—" She stopped, started again. "The way things are going." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret was a generous person," he said. "The most generous I've ever known." He looked at the fire. She didn't like empty rooms. She didn't like quiet that felt like something was missing. He paused. She would not have wanted the house to stay the way it was. Clara nodded slowly. "She would have liked you," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he was a man who said true things, she would have liked you a great deal. Clara looked at the fire. After a moment she said, "She had good taste in pianos." He almost smiled. "She did. And in ranches." "That too." A silence. "And in people," Clara said, very quietly. Elias looked at her. She was still looking at the fire, but the side of her face he could see was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she'd decided not to perform. "Yes," he said. "That too." The fire crackled. Neither of them said anything else, but neither of them moved apart either, and somewhere in that shared stillness, by that way, station fire in the middle of a January that was trying to bury everything under cold and difficulty, something that had been building for weeks quietly and without ceremony, became a fact. Tiad. Ruth met them at the edge of Billings in a hired carriage. She took one look at the two of them on the wagon seat, and her expression said everything she chose not to say out loud, which with Ruth was a rare and significant act of restraint. "Aldridge," she said instead, getting straight to it as they pulled into the city. "He's deteriorated faster than expected. The physician says travel to Holt Valley in February is not advisable." Clara's face went still. "He can't testify," she said. "He can testify. He cannot travel." Ruth looked at them both. "Which is why I've spoken with the circuit court clerk, and my husband has filed a formal request for the case to be heard in Billings rather than in the circuit's scheduled location. Given the nature of the fraud federal document falsification, there is grounds for venue change." She paused. "The request was approved this morning." Clara stared at her. "The hearing will be in Billings. 3rd week of February, 6 weeks from now." Ruth's voice was precise and satisfied. "Aldridge can testify from his home. Your documents are in the bank vault. My husband will file a formal objection to the guardianship petition tomorrow morning, citing the proactive evaluation you are already scheduled to complete." She looked at Clara directly. "Your uncle built his entire strategy around a March hearing in a rural circuit. He will spend the next several days discovering that everything has changed. Clara sat very still in the carriage. Then she said, "You moved the hearing." "The court moved the hearing," my husband asked. "There is a difference legally speaking." Ruth's expression was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Edmund Bennett is about to find out that the ground he was standing on has shifted." Clara breathed. One breath, slow and deliberate, and from somewhere deep. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, Ruth agreed. Which is enough time, barely, but enough. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her. She had been fighting for 2 years, alone and afraid, and moving fast enough to stay ahead of a man with 11 years of practice and considerable resources. She had walked 40 miles in the wrong coat, and shown up on a stranger's door, and asked for one night, and held her ground, and built her case, and refused to stop. And now, sitting in a hired carriage in Billings in January, with the hearing moved, and Aldridge confirmed, and the vault holding the copies, and Hector Vance willing to stand up, and Ruth's husband with the filing, and Elias beside her on the seat. 6 weeks. "All right," Clara said. And this time, it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like the beginning of something. They stayed in Billings 4 days. The competency evaluation took 1 morning and 2 follow-up conversations. The physician, a Dr. Marcus Webb, was thorough and direct, and asked Clara questions that were designed to find answers, rather than confirm predetermined conclusions. At the end of the second conversation, he told her he would file his report with the court and that his professional opinion would reflect what he had found. "Which is," Clara asked, "that you are one of the most structurally organized thinkers I have encountered in 15 years of practice," he said. "And that whoever filed this petition either has not met you or has met you and finds that quality threatening." He paused. "Probably both." Clara walked out of Dr. Webb's office and stood on the street in the January cold. Elias was waiting by the wagon. She walked to him and stopped and said, "He's going to file in our favor." "Good. Edmund is going to know by the end of the week." "Yes. He's going to escalate." "Probably." She looked at him. "You're not concerned." "I'm prepared," he said. "That's different from not concerned." She looked at him for a moment in the cold street with the city noise around them, and something moved through her face, through all the layers of it, through the careful and the strategic and the controlled, and came out the other side as something simple and clean and entirely unguarded. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Do what?" "Trust someone this much." She held his gaze. "I haven't done it in a very long time. I'm not sure I know how anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "You're doing it," he said. She looked at him. "Right now," he said. "You're doing it." She breathed, nodded once, and then she did something she hadn't done yet. Something small and deliberate that cost her something and was meant to, and that she had decided to pay. She put her hand in his. Not urgently, not desperately. The way you take someone's hand when you mean to keep it. Elias closed his fingers around hers. They stood on the street in Billings in January. For a moment, 2 people who had come very far from the night. A storm brought a stranger to a door, and a door opened to let her in. Then Clara said, "We should get back to Ruth. She has opinions about our filing strategy." "She has opinions about everything," Elias said. "She's usually right." "Don't tell her that." Clara laughed. Real, full, completely unguarded. The laugh that had first hit that kitchen like something returning after a long absence. He held her hand the whole walk back, and somewhere 400 miles east, Edmund Bennett was about to receive several pieces of information that would tell him the ground beneath his strategy had shifted entirely, and that the woman he'd spent 11 years controlling was no longer running. She was standing still. And she was not standing alone. They came home to a ranch that had been running itself. Tom had kept everything moving with the quiet competence of a man who had been doing exactly this, holding things together without being asked for the better part of a decade. The cattle were fed. The fences were intact. Billy had only broken one thing in 4 days, which Tom reported as a personal record. Daniel had seen the men at the north fence line twice more, and each time they had stayed on their side and eventually ridden away. Watching. Still just watching. But the quality of the watching had changed, and Elias felt it the moment he drove the wagon back through his gate. Something that had been loose and circling was tightening. Edmund Bennett was in Billings now. Ruth had sent word meeting with his lawyers after receiving the news about the venue change and the competency evaluation, and Aldridge's sworn affidavit filed that same week through Ruth's husband's office. 3 pieces of his strategy had collapsed in 4 days. A man like Edmund Bennett did not absorb that quietly. "He'll make a move before the hearing," Clara said that evening. She was at the kitchen table with her documents reorganizing everything into the order Ruth's husband had specified for the court filing. Her handwriting moved fast and clean across the page. "He's been patient for 11 years because patience was working. It's not working anymore." "What kind of move?" Elias said. "Something direct." She didn't look up. "He's been indirect because indirect was safe. Now he knows he's running out of time, and he knows I have Aldridge, and he knows the evaluation went against him." She paused. "He'll try to reach me, personally. Through Hale, maybe, or himself." She set down her pen. "My uncle is not a stupid man, Elias. He's careful and he's practiced, and he's been 3 steps ahead of everyone his entire life. When he comes, he'll come with something that looks reasonable, an offer, a compromise." She looked at him directly. "He'll try to make it easy for me to stop fighting." "And you won't?" "No. Simple. Absolute. But I want you to know it's coming, so when it does, you're not caught off guard." He looked at her across the table. "Why would I be caught off guard?" "Because the offer will probably include something for you." Her voice stayed even. "Something that makes it worth your while to convince me to take the deal. My uncle understands leverage, and he understands men who have something to lose." She held his gaze. "He'll try to buy you." The kitchen was quiet. "Clara," Elias said. "I'm not questioning you," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying, Clara." He said it the way he said her name when he wanted her to stop running ahead of herself and land in the present moment. "Do you think that would work?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "Then stop planning for it." She held his gaze for a moment. "I plan for everything," she said. "I know." He stood up. "Plan for winning instead." He went to check on the horses. She watched him go. Then she picked up her pen. And she planned for winning. Edmund Bennett came to Carter Ranch on a Thursday. He came alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or a strategy. Clara would have said it was both, which meant it was neither, which was how her uncle operated. He arrived mid-morning, riding a hired horse from the Holt Valley stable, wearing a coat that cost more than most men in this valley made in a year. He was 63, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had learned to look kind through long practice. Elias saw him ride up. He came out onto the porch. Edmund Bennett stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the ranch with the considering eyes of a man doing arithmetic. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me." "I didn't agree to see you," Elias said. "You rode up. That's different." A small pause, the kind that recalibrated without showing it. "Fair enough. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." "You can have them out here." Bennett dismounted, tied his horse, and came to the base of the porch steps. He looked up at Elias with an expression of practiced sincerity that Elias suspected had worked on a very large number of people across a very long career. "I'd like to speak with my niece," Bennett said. "Directly, without attorneys, without a slight gesture toward the House intermediaries. I believe there may be a resolution here that serves everyone." "There's a resolution coming in February," Elias said. "Billings, territorial court." "Courts are expensive," Bennett said. "Time-consuming, uncertain." He paused. "For everyone, including you, Mr. Carter. I understand you've become involved in this matter in ways that go beyond simple employment. There it was, right on schedule. I'm listening, Elias said, which was not agreement. It was information gathering. But Bennett heard what he wanted to hear, because men like Edmund Bennett always did. Clara is my brother's child, Bennett said. Whatever difficulties have arisen between us, that is the fundamental truth. I want her well. I want her settled. I want her future secured. He looked at Elias steadily. I'm prepared to make a substantial settlement offer. Financial. Property. Enough to make this worthwhile for her to resolve without going before a court. A pause. And I'm prepared to include a consideration for you, Mr. Carter, for your hospitality and your, another slight pause, investment in this situation. The morning was cold and quiet around them. What kind of consideration? Elias said. The northern parcel of the Bennett estate borders the county line at Caldwell. Approximately 300 acres of good grazing land that I understand has been in some legal ambiguity for several years. He held Elias's gaze. That ambiguity could be resolved in your favor very quickly by the right person with the right standing. 300 acres, good grazing land at the county line. It was a real offer. A serious offer. The kind built on actual knowledge of what a man like Elias Carter would value. Edmund Bennett had done his homework. And in exchange, Elias said, I talked Clara into taking the settlement. I wouldn't characterize it as talking her into anything. I'd characterize it as helping her see the wisdom of a resolution that serves her interests. And removes the fraud case from the court record, Elias said. The pleasant expression didn't shift. The case is based on documents whose authenticity is in question. A settlement simply acknowledges that legal proceedings are imperfect and that reasonable people can find common ground outside of them. And James Aldridge, Elias said, is he part of the common ground? A very brief pause, too brief for most people to catch. Elias caught it. Mr. Aldridge is an elderly man in uncertain health, Bennett said carefully. His recollections of surveys conducted 15 years ago may not be entirely reliable. He kept the original records, Elias said, the physical documents, with his own notes from the time. He watched Bennett's face. Not recollections, records. There's a difference. Something moved behind the kind eyes. The first real thing not calculated, not performed. Actual. Fear. Edmund Bennett was afraid of James Aldridge. Not of Clara, not of the court, not of the hearing. Of a 71-year-old retired land commissioner and his physical records from 1871. Elias filed that away. I'll tell Clara you came, he said. The answer is no, to all of it. Bennett looked at him. The pleasant expression was still there, but it had thinned over the real thing underneath. You're making a significant decision on her behalf. I'm making a decision on mine, Elias said. What Clara decides is Clara's business. He met the man's eyes. But I'll tell you what I told Richard Hale. I built everything I have on ground that didn't want me here. I'm not moving for a man who builds his fortune on someone else's land and calls it management. A silence. Bennett looked at him for a long moment. Then he untied his horse. You're certain, he said. About most things, Elias said. This especially. Bennett mounted. Looked at the ranch once more. The arithmetic was running behind his eyes, and Elias could see it arriving at a conclusion that hadn't been the plan. February, Bennett said almost to himself. February. Elias agreed. Bennett rode away. Elias stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. Then he went inside. Clara was in the kitchen. She had been there the whole time. He knew because the kitchen window faced the yard, and she would have seen everything. And when he came in, her face confirmed it. She had watched the whole conversation from where she stood, which was exactly what she'd told him she would do, because she'd told him she planned for everything. She didn't ask what was said. She'd seen enough. What she said was, he's afraid of Aldridge. Yes. You saw it. Yes, she breathed. One long breath. That means the original records contradict his modified version more severely than I knew. Severely enough that he came 400 miles personally to try to stop Aldridge from testifying. She looked at Elias. What's in those records is worse than I thought. Or better, Elias said, depending on which side you're on. She looked at him. He offered you land, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Good land. 300 acres at the county line. A silence. She understood exactly what that meant and what it cost him to say no without hesitation. And she didn't perform surprise or gratitude, she just sat with the reality of it and let him see that she understood. Thank you, she said. Stop. I mean it. I know you mean it. He sat down at the table across from her. Which is why I'm telling you to stop. You don't thank someone for not betraying you, Clara. That's just being a person. She looked at him. Not everyone is, she said quietly. He held her gaze. I know. The kitchen held them both in its warmth. Outside, Edmund Bennett was riding back to Holt Valley to regroup and rethink and arrive at the next move, and the next move would be harder and less generous, because that was what cornered men did. They got smaller on the inside and louder on the outside, and they started reaching for things they'd held in reserve. He'll come at Aldridge, Clara said, directly this time. Try to discredit him before the hearing. Medical records age reliability, anything that puts doubt on the testimony. Ruth's husband has already filed Aldridge's professional credentials with the court record, Elias said. 15 years of government service. No disciplinary record. Every survey he filed holds up. Edmund will find something. Let him try. Elias looked at her. 6 weeks, Clara. 5 now. 5 weeks, he agreed. You've held for 2 years. You can hold 5 more weeks. She was quiet. Then, I'm not worried about holding. She looked at him with the directness she'd had from the first night, the directness that had looked like stubbornness and turned out to be the truest thing about her. I'm worried about what comes after. After the hearing. After everything. She held his gaze. I've spent 2 years thinking about nothing but the case, getting the evidence, getting to court, getting through. Her voice was even, but something underneath it was not. I haven't thought about what I do when it's done. Elias looked at her for a long moment. I have, he said. She went very still. You have, she said. Yes. And, he reached across the table, put his hand over hers. And I'd like to know if you're willing to stay, he said. After. Not as my housekeeper. Not as something that needs a name right now. He held her gaze and said the true thing plainly, the way he said all true things. Just stay. Be here. Let this be your place, the way it's become your place already. A pause. If that's what you want. Clara looked at his hand over hers. She looked at the kitchen, the herbs on the windowsill. She'd planted the curtains. She'd repaired the piano audible in the next room, even in its silence. She looked at the table where she'd spent 100 evenings, and the stove that had fed 6 men 3 times a day, and the doorway through which Tom came for coffee, and Billy came with questions, and Daniel came quietly, and left something cleaner behind him each time. She looked at Elias. This is already my place, she said. His hand tightened slightly on hers. Then we agree, he said. We agree, she said. And that was that. No ceremony, no performance. 2 people who said what they meant and meant what they said, arriving at the same place from different distances and recognizing it when they got there. The escalation came 2 weeks later, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Catherine Marsh arrived in Holt Valley, Clara's former friend, the woman who had told Edmund Bennett about the documents. She arrived alone on the stage from Caldwell and took a room at the hotel and sent a message to Carter Ranch asking to see Clara. Clara read the message at breakfast. She set it down. No, she said. Elias looked at her. You don't want to hear what she has to say. I know what she has to say. Clara's voice was flat. Edmund sent her. Catherine is what Edmund uses when legal strategies fail. She's personable, and she's convincing, and she knows me well enough to know exactly what to say to make me doubt myself. She looked at the message. He sent her because 300 acres didn't work, and direct intimidation didn't work, and now he's going back to the personal. You're sure she's working for him? Clara looked up. I'm sure she was working for him when she told him about my documents. Whether she believes she's doing it for him now or believes she's doing it for me doesn't change what it is. Her jaw was tight. She'll come with an apology, with a reason that sounds like love and loyalty, and underneath it will be whatever Edmund asked her to carry. Elias was quiet. You said she was your closest friend for 6 years, he said. Clara looked at the message. Something moved through her face. Not the controlled thing, not the strategic thing. The real thing. The particular human damage of betrayal by someone you loved. She said. That doesn't stop being real just because she did something wrong. Clara looked at him. No, she said. It doesn't. A silence. What if she came on her own? He said carefully. Without Edmund. Clara shook her head. She didn't. But if she did? She looked at the message for a long moment. Then I'd want to know, she said quietly. And I'd want to know why. Elias stood up. I'll go with you. No, she stood too. I'll go alone. She met his eyes before he could object. The same reason I saw Judge Pearson alone. If Catherine came on her own, she won't say what she came to say with you standing there. And if Edmund sent her, I need to hear what he sent with her without you in the way. A pause. I can handle Catherine. I know you can handle her, Elias said. That's not why I want to come. She looked at him. I know why you want to come, she said, quieter now. I know. She held his gaze. But I have to do this myself. He looked at her for a long moment. Take Tom's horse, he said. It's faster than yours. She almost smiled. All right. Ball. She was gone 3 hours. Elias spent those 3 hours doing the work of the ranch with the specific focused intensity of a man who is occupying his hands so his mind has something to anchor to. He fixed 2 sections of fence in the south pasture that had been on the list for a week. He cleaned and organized the equipment shed. He had a long, mostly one-sided conversation with Duchess about the general reliability of horses, as compared to human beings, which Duchess received with dignified attention. Tom found him in the shed at the 2-hour mark. She's not back yet, Tom said. Not a question. No. Tom leaned on the doorframe. You're worried. I'm working. Same thing from where I'm standing. Elias put down what he was holding. Catherine Marsh betrayed her once. If she came here to do it again, Clara will handle it, Tom said. I know she will. That's not the point. What's the point? Elias looked at him. She shouldn't have to keep handling things alone. Tom was quiet for a moment. She's not alone, he said. That's the difference now. She knows that. Whatever happens in that hotel room, she goes in, knowing she's coming back to a place that's hers, and people who are hers. He paused. That changes a person, changes what they can handle. Elias picked up what he'd put down. Tom went back to his work. An hour later, he heard Tom's horse come back through the gate. He came out of the shed. Clara dismounted and tied the horse and came across the yard. Her face was different. Not devastated. Not triumphant. Something more complicated and more human than either. Well, he said, Edmund didn't send her. She stopped in front of him. She came alone. He waited. She came to tell me that Edmund has a witness, Clara said. A man who claims to have seen me altering documents in Arthur Gaines's office in Caldwell. Edmund is planning to introduce him at the hearing in February. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the thing underneath it. She didn't come to stop me. She came to warn me. Why? Clara was quiet for a moment. Because she said she spent 4 months telling herself she hadn't done anything wrong by telling Edmund about the documents, and then spent 4 more months trying to stop believing that, and eventually stopped being able to. She held his gaze. She said she couldn't fix what she'd done, but she could give me the name. The name of the witness. Yes. Clara pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. A man named George Tillis. He worked briefly as a clerk at the county surveyor's office. He was dismissed for falsifying records 18 months ago. A pause. He was dismissed because Arthur Gaines reported him. Elias looked at the paper. "He's lying for Edmund," he said. "He's lying for Edmund," Clara confirmed. "And Arthur Gaines's dismissal report is on file with the county, which means his credibility as a witness has a documented problem." She folded the paper back. "Ruth's husband can have that report in front of the circuit court before the hearing." Elias looked at her. She was standing in his yard in January, with her jaw set and her eyes clear, and a piece of paper in her hand that had just shifted the last piece of Edmund's strategy, and she looked for the first time since he'd known her, not like someone fighting to survive, like someone who had already won. She just hadn't gotten to the hearing yet. "And Catherine," he said. Clara was quiet. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what we are now, what we can be after." She paused. But she looked me in the eyes, and I looked back, and I believed her. A pause. "I think I believed her." "That's enough for now," he said. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." She handed him Tom's reins, went inside. Elias stood for a moment holding the reins. Then he put the horse up, and went to find the telegraph office address in Billings, to wire Ruth's husband. The hearing convened on the 19th of February in a courtroom in Billings that smelled like wood smoke and old paper, and the particular formality of a place where things got decided. Elias sat in the gallery. Tom sat beside him, which had not been discussed, and was simply where Tom was when Elias arrived. Ruth sat on the other side, which had also not been discussed, and was simply Ruth. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table with Ruth's husband Wallace beside her. She was in the same dress she'd worn to see Judge Pearson. Her back was straight. Her documents were organized in front of her in the exact order Wallace had specified. Her hands were flat on the table. Elias watched her back. He had watched Clara Bennett for 3 months. He had watched her cook and plan and fight and laugh and play the piano and hold herself together through things that would have broken a lesser person. He had watched her hands and her face and her eyes and learned to read all three well enough to know the difference between what she showed and what she felt. Right now she was afraid, not shaking, not crumbling, not showing it to anyone in that room. But he knew the particular set of her shoulders when something was costing her, and this was costing her everything she had. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, as though the inch made a difference, as though she could feel it. Maybe she could, because right then, she turned her head just slightly. Not toward the gallery, not toward Elias, specifically. Just a small movement, a small check, like something in her wanted to confirm the room was what she thought it was. Then she turned back, and her shoulders settled. Just slightly. Just enough. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Edmund Bennett's lawyers were good. They were expensive, thorough, and professionally confident in the way of men who had won many times and expected to win again. They presented their case with smooth precision. Clara's mental state, the reliability of the documents, the character witnesses from Caldwell, who did not appear in person, but whose written testimonials were read into the record. And then George Tillis took the stand and testified that he had personally witnessed Clara Bennett altering documents in Arthur Gaines's office in the spring of 1882. The courtroom was very quiet when he finished. Wallace stood. He introduced the county dismissal report for George Tillis filed by Arthur Gaines in September of 1882. He noted for the record that Tillis had been removed from his position specifically for falsifying documents, the same act he was now accusing Clara of. and that the report had been signed, witnessed, and filed 5 months before Arthur Gaines's death. He then called James Aldridge. Aldridge was brought in by his son because he walked with difficulty now, and he was thin, and he moved slowly, but when he sat down, he sat up straight, and his voice when he spoke was exact and completely steady. He had been a land commissioner for 15 years. He had conducted the original Bennett Estate Survey in 1871. He had kept personal copies of his work, as was his practice, because he had learned early in his career that filed documents could be altered. He produced his personal records. He produced a comparison he had prepared between his original measurements and the measurements in the currently filed county record. He walked the court through the discrepancies. There were 11 of them. 11 separate points at which the filed record differed from the original survey, each difference consistently serving to reduce the documented value of the estate Clara should have inherited and increase the documented value of what Edmund Bennett claimed to have managed independently. The math was not subtle. 11 years of systematic fraud. Every number there in James Aldridge's careful hand, documented in 1871 and compared against the modified record and the gap between them, told a story that no smooth attorney and no paid witness and no character testimony from Caldwell could touch. Edmund Bennett's face, when Elias looked at him across the courtroom, was the face of a man watching ground disappear. Clara's face was very still. She was looking at the documents in front of her. Then she looked at Aldridge. The old man looked back at her. He nodded once. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She didn't cry. That wasn't Clara. But something in her face broke open and reformed the way things do when something you have been holding at enormous cost for an enormous time finally lifts. Wallace spoke for another 40 minutes. Edmund's attorney spoke for 20. The judge, a circuit judge named William Cord, who had been hearing territorial cases for 12 years and had the expression of a man who had seen most things and was not easily surprised by any of them, listened to all of it. He deliberated for 1 hour. When he returned, he read his finding in the measured cadence of a man who understood that the words he was saying would live in the record long after the moment passed. He found the documentary evidence credible and Aldridge's testimony compelling. He found the alteration of filed government survey records to constitute fraud upon both the estate and the territorial court. He found Edmund Bennett's counterclaims unsupported by independent evidence and George Tillis's testimony not credible, given the documented record of his own falsification. He ordered the immediate restoration of the original Bennett estate records. He ordered a full accounting to be conducted by an independent land commissioner. He referred the matter of document falsification to the federal territorial prosecutor for further investigation. He looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett," he said, "the court finds in your favor." The courtroom was not silent. There was noise, movement, voices, the shift of people processing what they'd just heard. Edmund Bennett's lawyers were already moving. Edmund himself sat very still for a long moment, and then he stood up slowly, and he looked at Clara across the courtroom. And what was on his face was not rage and was not defeat. It was something older and simpler and more honest than either. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for 11 years and had just set it down and discovered it had cost him everything he'd used it to protect. Clara did not look away. She held his gaze steadily. Edmund Bennett put on his hat. He walked out. He did not look back. Outside the courthouse in the cold February air, Clara stood on the steps with Wallace and Ruth and did not move for a long moment. Elias came out behind her and stopped. She turned. She looked at him with the walls down all the way, all of it present, 2 years of fighting and 3 months of holding, and everything she had spent and everything she had gained right there in her face without any management of it at all. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked back. And then Clara Bennett, who did not cry and did not break and did not ask for more than she could carry, did something she had not done in front of anyone since she was 14 years old, and her father died and left her in a house with a man who saw her as a problem to be managed. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just tears, quiet and real, running down her face, while she stood on the courthouse steps in Billings in February, with the wind coming off the river. Elias crossed the 2 steps between them and put his arms around her. She put her face against his coat. Ruth looked at Wallace. Wallace looked at the street. Tom, who had come out behind them, looked at the sky with the specific interest of a man who has suddenly found it extremely compelling. Clara cried for approximately 45 seconds. Then she straightened, stepped back, wiped her face with her sleeve with the practicality of someone who has never had patience for prolonged emotional displays, including their own. "That was indulgent," she said. "That was earned," Elias said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It was." Ruth handed her a handkerchief from somewhere. Clara took it, used it, handed it back. "The estate accounting will take months," Clara said. Her voice was almost entirely even. "The federal investigation could take longer. I'll need to be in contact with the land commissioner they appoint." She paused. "I'll need to be reachable." "You live on a ranch in Holt Valley," Elias said. "You're reachable." She looked at him. "I live on a ranch in Holt Valley," she said quietly. Like she was trying the sentence on. Like she was deciding if it fit. It fit. She knew it fit. "Yes," she said. "I do." Ruth made a small sound that was not quite a word and was entirely satisfied. Wallace studied the street. Tom remained absorbed in the sky. "Can we eat?" Elias said. "It's past noon and I haven't eaten since Holt Valley." Clara looked at him, and she laughed. The real one. The full one. The one that had first hit his kitchen like something returned from a long absence and had been filling it every day since. "Yes," she said. "We can eat." They went home the following morning. The road back from Billings to Holt Valley took a day and a half the same way it always did, but it was a different road, not in its geography, which hadn't changed, but in everything the 2 people traveling it were carrying. Clara slept for 2 hours in the wagon, which she would never have allowed herself to do 3 months ago. She woke up when the road got rough near the Valley Pass, looked at the landscape and settled back against the seat with the ease of someone who knows where they're going and trusts the way to get there. Elias drove. He drove the way he did everything steadily without hurry, with his attention on what was in front of him. After a while, Clara said without particular preamble, "I want to write to Catherine." He didn't look away from the road. "All right." "I don't know what to say yet." "You'll figure it out." "I might not be able to forgive her." "You don't have to decide that now." She was quiet. "But I want to try, to figure out if I can." "That's enough," he said. "Trying is enough." She looked at him. "You're very sensible," she said. "I'm practical," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Sensible is a compliment. Practical is just a description." She looked at him with the almost smile. "You're both. Don't push it." She laughed. He held the reins steady. The valley opened around them in the winter afternoon, wide and cold and familiar. And when the Carter Ranch came into view at the end of the road, the house, the barn, the smoke from the kitchen stovepipe rising thin and straight into the cold air. Elias felt what he always felt coming home. But today it was different. Today it was larger. He looked at Clara. She was looking at the ranch with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not assessing, not strategic, not careful. Just looking. The way you look at something that belongs to you. The way you look at something you chose. "Home," she said, quietly, to herself as much as to him. "Home," he agreed. They drove through the gate. Billy was in the yard before they stopped, full of questions and energy, and the particular relief of a 19-year-old who had been responsible for things for several days and found it considerably more difficult than anticipated. Daniel was at the barn door, quiet and present. Tom was on the porch with coffee, which was exactly where Tom would be. Clara stepped down from the wagon before Elias came around to help her, which was how she always did things, and she walked up to Tom and took the coffee he was already holding out. Well, Tom said. We won, Clara said. Tom nodded once, the nod of a man who had never seriously entertained the alternative. Good. Completely good, Clara said. Also, Aldridge is remarkable, and you were right about the bank vault. I'm right about most things, Tom said. It's a burden. I'll tell your wife you said that. She already knows. He almost smiled. Welcome home, Miss Bennet. Clara looked at him. Something moved through her face. Clara, she said. Please. Tom nodded. Welcome home, Clara. She went inside. Elias came up the porch steps. Tom handed him the second cup of coffee. They stood for a moment, looking at the yard, the familiar geometry of the ranch they'd both worked on for years, the land that had tried to resist and eventually agreed to let people stay. It's different, Tom said. Yes, Elias agreed. Good different. Yes. Tom drank his coffee. Billy broke the weather vane while you were gone. I know. How do you know? Because it was only a matter of time. Elias drank his coffee. I'll fix it tomorrow. He feels terrible about it. He should feel terrible about it? But you'll fix it. I'll fix it. Elias looked at the house. From inside came the sound of Clara moving in the kitchen, the particular rhythm of her. The sounds that had become the sounds of the house over 3 months, until the house without them was a different, lesser place. Because that's what you do with things worth keeping. You fix them when they break, and you keep going. Tom stood beside him. The kitchen sounds continued. After a moment, from deeper in the house, something else, the piano. A few notes tentative at first. Then the phrase Clara had been building since the night she'd uncovered it. Then more, the whole shape of it growing, and confident, the music of someone who has found the instrument they were supposed to be playing, and is no longer uncertain about whether they have the right to play it. Elias listened. Tom listened. The music filled the house and came out through the windows into the cold afternoon air and spread across the yard and the barn and the wide Montana Valley beyond. Tom cleared his throat. She's good. Yes, Elias said. She is. Tom went to find Billy. Elias stood on the porch alone and listened to Clara play. He stood there until the phrase resolved and the music found its ending clean, certain completely itself, and then he went inside. Because this was his home, and she was in it. And those two facts, which had been separate things for 5 long and empty years, had become one thing. One whole, complete, irreversible thing. The woman who had asked for shelter had become the reason the house had one. The cowboy who had asked for laughter had discovered it was only the beginning of what he'd needed. And Carter Ranch, built by hand on ground that had tried to refuse them both, stood solid and warm against the Montana winter, not because of its walls or its fences or its land, but because of the 2 people inside it who had chosen against the long odds of loneliness and loss and the accumulated damage of lives that had tried to break them to stay. That was the home. That had always been the home. It just needed the right people to walk through the door.